the fear for me is that we will continue on the way we're going, and that digital divide is even greater. So that's what I'm really worried about, because in the 90s, it was at a certain level, and I thought I had lots of time to take care of it. But here I am, 2023, and I'm still losing that battle.
You're listening to One Feather, Two Pens. Lessons and stories from Indigenous peoples, building and navigating digital sovereignty. A special series on What's That Noise?
Hello, Gaelic Kesla. Welcome everyone to our podcast today, and really look forward to having you share space with us today as we continue our conversation around digital indigeneity and the topics around data sovereignty and identity and our role there. And I want to take a moment, as always, at the front end of this to just convey an acknowledgement, a land acknowledgement. Seems odd to do this in a podcast and from folks that are all across Turtle Island, but I think it's important that we just take a moment to, in our own way, reflect on our thanks and our appreciation for living and working and playing in Indigenous communities across the country. I'm coming to you from Victoria, so a shout out to the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, the Lekwungen speaking people, where I live and work and play, and where OneFeather operates its business, and an appreciation and a love for that community that allows us to be here in a good way and do work and share this space with them, and with the utmost respect and gratitude for them for allowing us to be here. So I trust you'll take a moment to reflect on that wherever you are and say thanks in your way. Again, really appreciate you joining us today.
As eloquent and as appreciated as ever. Thank you very much, my friend Lawrence. And to Al Coombs, Al, buddy, wherever you are on Turtle Island, we're looking forward to having you back on the show. And I know you're reflecting the same sentiments as Lawrence and myself as you're sitting there wherever the heck you happen to be listening right now. But in the meantime, we're really excited to press forward with our guest, James Delorme. James, thanks so much for joining us. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. Emot samsquagan, kochu kapi, nishtes geje. So what I said was, I feel good. And so I was speaking in Ijutham, and the Ijutham language is a combination of Hamalko, Klahoose, and Tla'amin First Nations. It's a Coast Salish dialect in the north Vancouver Island region. So what I said was, I feel good. I also said that we come from this place. And then lastly, I said, we're all related. And so on that theme, that's how I usually start, when I speak to folks and introduce myself, because that's probably the closest Indigenous language that I have more connection to. But I'll tell you it's a bit of a story about who Mr. Delorme is. But first I want to recognize Lawrence, and thank you, Lawrence, for that great introduction and land territorial recognition. So often it just becomes sort of like standard status quo that the words that are, mentioned before every meeting in front of crowds. And we have to take time, like you said, to really understand those words and what they mean for that territory that you're coming from. So my English name is James Delorme, and that's what I've been named since birth. I'm coming to you today from the Lheidli-T'enneh territory, which they call Prince George, British Columbia. And I'm here as a visitor, and this is where my business is, Indigelink.io. And Tommy, thank you so much. A really great introduction, and thank you for welcoming me here. And OneFeather, a huge shout out to you, to that organization. And Lawrence and I go way back. But Lawrence, just so impressed with what you've done in this space, and especially with tech. Bridging that digital divide is huge. So a little bit about Mr. Delorme. So I'm a member officially under the Indian Act as a Klahoose member, but my family don't originate from Klahoose. My dad, Robert Delorme, is from Cowessess First Nation, and that's in Treaty 4 territory. So if listeners don't know where that is, that's in Saskatchewan. They're Cree, Assiniboine speaking folks. So Dad grew up at Cowessess. A lot of my relatives like my auntie Lina Coos, she's the chief of Zagame First Nation, and my grandfather's from Cowessess. My grandmother is next door at Kakawistahau, and many relatives on that side of the family all come from Cowessess or from Treaty 4 territory, so they're Cree, Assiniboine. So the next question is, how did you become a Klahoose member? Klahoose people are Coast Salish, and nothing to do with Cree or Assiniboine. But I was welcomed into the community many years ago. I have three kids in total that are Klahoose members. So I transferred under the Indian Act. I transferred over to Klahoose. They're Coast Salish speaking, and I have a real connection to the Klahoose people. Eventually, the elders in the community said, why don't you run for chief, or what they call Hey Goose? And so I did. I ran for chief, and I was chief there for 3 terms, a total of 6 years. Wow. And under that leadership, and this is kind of leads into our discussion today, it's a bit of a discussion of innovation, or it's a story of innovation. So it was the innovation of me moving to a different community, also taking some of the tools of early days of the internet and social media like Facebook, and turning that into a leadership position where I now influence and work in a space where I get to explore tech solutions in modern day situations. So I also have to recognize the European side of my family. I'll step back a little bit. And my mother and her family, they're farmers from Manitoba. And so on the paternal side, they're from Iceland. And my grandmother is Scottish. So I call myself Indigenous Viking. And so a lot of people say, hey, aren't you Métis? It's like, no, let's get this straight. But it's a story of innovation of how I became chief of Klahoose, where my parents originated from. But I want to just lay the foundation here and let you know that this is a place of privilege. So when I say that, what I mean by that is that I was privileged by the elders who have taught me about who my family was and how I became to be in my position. And that's really critical because so many of our relatives, Lawrence knows this very, very well, because of residential schools, because of the 60 Scoop, a lot of our family and friends are not connected to their communities like I am. So I do hold a position of privilege, and I recognize that. And I'm always encouraging sisters and brothers to seek out their family as best they can. So that's a little introduction of James. And I have my own digital media company and do a lot of research and decentralization and various other things. Work with a lot of large companies. I help guide digital media companies like KPMG, Deloitte, the Dene Nation, various other folks. Big supporter of OneFeather. And I'm kind of in a unique position as a Indigenous digital individual, but I love the space, and it's just growing and growing. So glad to be here today.
Awesome,
Thank
James.
you.
I mean, it's amazing. As always, you speak from a place of awareness, right, and a recognition and humility in terms of origin and who you are and where you come from. And I think taking time to identify that you've got a foot in both worlds, I think is important, and I think it just speaks to who you are as an individual, but an integrity of your actions and who you are. So thank you for that amazing introduction to you and what you do. And I'm going to just jump right in. I'm going to ask you a pretty broad question, and I'm going to, as the former chief of the Klahoose First Nation and a former board member of the BCAFN, what does Indigenous data sovereignty mean to you? What does it mean to James Delorme? And then what does it mean in your context or your perspective to Indigenous people and our communities, given that, some of us are tightly woven with our communities, some of us less so, and some of us not at all. And how, how do we navigate that space? What does that mean to you?
What a question. It's the thing is I'm just so passionate about it because I've been doing it for so long. And, so to have this opportunity to actually talk about it in this space is just like, I'm not going to say a dream come true, but it's a relief, because now in this, space that we're living in the modern context of digital identity and digital, the digital methodologies, people are forced to look at data sovereignty and data governance in a very, very practical way. Mm-hmm. So thanks for that question, Lawrence. And so actually, I bring it down to the community level. I bring it down to, my experiences at Klahoose and traditional gathering. And this is something this will resonate with you, Lawrence, and because I know your connection to your community. So one of the problems that we had at Klahoose that I recognized early on was that a lot of our members were really questioning our cultural identity. And so they would say to me, I don't really know my cultural identity. I don't know what it means to be a Klahoose member, other than I've got a status number. We go to the band office to get our social needs. And but I knew right away because we were doing things like we were harvesting off the beaches, we were digging clams, we would hunt, we would go after cedar boughs for specific ceremonial reasons. There was a differences between not only the tides, but the seasons on when we could do things. There's a very spiritual aspect of what we do. It's an oral tradition, how that's passed on. There's things that, cultural artwork that we did that mostly was taught from one elder to a younger person. All these things are information that's really valuable to that cultural identity. And so I really started to dig down into that. What does that mean for our people? And how is that going to benefit us? Because as I went on and started to see research projects that were happening, and a lot of research universities, research companies were actually taking that information that we had and using it as part of their studies and part of their work. And there's a financial piece to that was created, and we never had a choice in that. So I started to see the actual the problems that were attached to taking that information from our communities and then taking that to other institutions. So at the community level, that's where it's important to me, because if we don't have that sense of security and that ability to that we know that our data is safe within our community, that data is not being used by another entity. I'll give you another example, Lawrence. But if we don't recognize that has to be part of what we do in our daily lives, and it belongs to us, and can't be used by somebody else. If we don't have that realization, it'll continue to happen.
Right. So
I had to actually break that cycle. And when I was when I was chief, I had to start saying, even though we reported to the federal government through a band council resolution, we have to start maintaining our own records for our own people, and that involved cultural practices. For sure, yeah. So that's where the foundations of it is for me. But there's a much larger conversation, of course.
So, thank you for that. And I think I agree. I think one of the challenges especially in this modern digital age, is that there's a lot of content being created, right? And the steward and how it's being curated. First of all, how it's being curated is one thing. And then who is curating is the other. And then the third is who has custody of that curation? Like, who has custody of that data? And in my view, you can't have data sovereignty, or you can't have sovereignty unless you both own and have custody. And so from a digital data perspective, any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, and you're absolutely correct, Lawrence. And where the rubber hits the road, if you will, is the fact that data governance has to be a part of our communities. We have to embrace it and understand it so that we can actually solve some of those issues that you're talking about. Because the one thing that we see is that clearly that technology is moving that content forward, and we can't keep up. We can't, we could certainly bring in policy and some ways to actually combat how that content is being out in public and being used by the public. But if we don't understand ourselves, our own communities, it's really tough to actually implement any data sovereignty proposals or policy without knowing what it is. So the education piece of our communities knowing that is really critical. So, but yes, you've touched on something really important. We're just scratching the surface of what data governance is. And I really like the OCAP principles. I don't know if you've explored that at all.
Yeah.
So,
sure.
in a lot of ways, it's a mandate from the Assembly of First Nations. So I've heard treaty people say, well, that's all great. OCAP principles are wonderful, the ownership, control, access, and possession. But the treaty voice, as along the same ways of Indian Act First Nation, all has to be included in the work. So all that data governance has to keep that in mind. So when I was working with KPMG, we were actually working on a business use case for KPMG for the First Nations Information Governance Center.
Right.
And so that work, actually, we had to keep that Indigenous lens going because the folks at KPMG are wonderful, really great people, but they had no concept or understanding of what the Indigenous lens was. So when you put it in that context, you kind of realize that we have these large organizations that are collecting data, but do they really understand that Indigenous lens? And do they understand how that data governance and that data sovereignty needs to be upheld?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that lived experience as Indigenous people too, like if you have never lived that, you really have no idea. Right. And the sensitivity around that. So yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
I want to bring my good friend Tommy in and
hi, I'm still here.
Move us along. Tommy, you've been listening to us go on here, and I you've been busy typing, and I know you've got something that's burning to
just a few minutes ago.
Go for it, brother.
And the listener will not have heard this. You guys didn't hear this because I fortunately have removed it in the recording, but there was a stretch there where James was talking and I was just clanging away on my keyboard because I screwed up my audio settings, and Lawrence had to stop us and was like, hey, Tommy, buddy, just so you know, have that cool note taking you're doing to get ready for your questions. Can hear all of it and I can't hear a thing that James is saying. So gentlemen, I apologize. Thank you very much for your patience. And the last thing that I want to do is slow this conversation down. I think there's incredible momentum. I think a lot of listeners right now are generally going to understand what data sovereignty means or data governance. They might even have some familiarity with OCAP. But I was hoping we could just level set for a minute. James, could you tell us a little bit more about what data sovereignty and or data governance means from an Indigenous lens? I think this is really important.
Oh, that's a huge question because that concept or that idea, as mentioned, is really just starting to percolate, and I don't want to speak for Lawrence, but I can almost see that some of the experiences that you had, Lawrence, when you're talking to people. Lawrence and I were on a panel in Indigenomics recently, and you could see a lot of people there like, oh yeah, that sounds really good. I've heard of cryptocurrencies, and they get this sort of like glossy-eyed look in their face, and they're wanting to understand. They're really trying to understand just Indigenous lens, not even go into that sort of other world of digital Indigenous lens. So there's really a level of adoption that has to take place, and that's what I see as a critical point. Break that cycle of that digital divide for our communities. Is that it's not just the Indigenous community, it's also the non-Indigenous communities that have to recognize that is an important piece. So that allyship becomes even more amplified when we talk about TRC work and how those calls to action actually, get into communities to make sure that Indigenous lens, which is, as you mentioned, it's broad, it's a big piece of work, but we also have to include that in those digital activities. So, I'll give you some examples of how that works.
Oh, awesome. This is great.
Yeah, great. Board of directors. A lot of folks have been, pushing for more Indigenous folks on boards. Well, we have to do better. We have to take that next step and have that Indigenous voice in the on the board and making decisions on how to have that board, because that's what's going to drive the innovation and that early adoption of learning. And so we're getting there. There's a lot of good examples of that. But it's recognizing the companies like OneFeather and other companies that are, and hope you don't mind me, Lawrence, but Plato Testing, really great technology companies that are doing some amazing work promoting, digital sovereignty. And we have to actually amplify that even more. We have to bring in more business. We need to bring in more investment. And we need to have, when you talk about, okay, what is that digital lens, Indigenous digital lens? Well, it has to be defined by the Indigenous people. It has to be, our participation to be able to drive it, because normally it's top down. It's a tech company that brings that down and says, hey, this is how it is. And either you get on board or you don't. But we're flipping the switch a little bit. We're going, actually, no, it's the Indigenous lens that actually drives that technology. Because if you take the concept of protocols, so we have protocols with computers, you have protocols with APIs, with various technology solutions and even progressive solutions. But we also have protocols in our communities, and Lawrence will attest to this. And those protocols basically move in sync. And when they do move in sync, we have a very beautiful relationship that actually creates all kinds of innovation. But if something's out of sync, it does not work. And we see that there's an imbalance in the technologies, there's an imbalance with early adoption, and ultimately society suffers because we don't have that Indigenous lens.
James, I sincerely appreciate you explaining these difficult and ambiguous concepts to us in such a clear and accessible way. I think it's really helping us put into focus what we mean on the show when we talk about digital indigeneity and an indigenous lens, if I may, on data sovereignty and data governance. And even still, I'm still a bit uncomfortable and a bit conceptually confused around the usage of the word sovereignty. James, my background is in the academy, and the intellectual community that I'm from generally looks at the term sovereignty as very political. It has a very clear and separable historical dimension to it, in that it's monarchical. It's about emperor, it's about ruler, it's about those who have and those who do not have.
Right.
When I hear sovereignty, I think of monarchy, and I think about one way we say what you do and you dance. And James, I have to say that even as a privileged white man from a historically very conservative city, the word makes me cringe. It makes me cringe because I have a hard time imagining how an historically disenfranchised and abused Indigenous population can ever amass that same kind of sovereign control, the same amount of power. And as I listen to you and as I listen to our other guests, I continually learn that there's a fundamental rearticulation of some of these historical concepts in a really productive way, that there is room and capacity to think about this in a more horizontal and cooperative way, for example. Maybe sovereignty here means creating, holding, and sharing space so that OCAP principles can actually be realized and deployed in a meaningful and equal way. Perhaps in a way that redistributes those unequal amounts of power towards Indigenous populations so that they have more agency over the flows of data and information out there. I mean, there has to be rearticulation here, because otherwise sovereignty does not leave room for redistributing power. That's the purpose of it. It's to wield and concentrate power in one body, into one source.
That's a really good point, Tommy. And
I'm glad to have offered one, because after having listened to you, James, I don't think I was going to be able to.
No, I love it, because really that's the Indigenous lens. So Lawrence, I don't know if I'd love to hear from Lawrence's perspective, but really from what you just said, you're absolutely right. It's a colonial concept, and we've been colonial for a very long time. So a lot of people say to me, "Well, James, let's actually replace the status card." And I see what's going on with Lawrence's company, OneFeather, with the decentralization, which we'll probably talk about. And that's a research project that we've been working on for some time with my company. But we understand those concepts of having the Indigenous lens. And there's a lot of First Nations and Indigenous communities who are adopting their own, I'll give you an example, specific names of their community. So in a treaty situation, you could have that written into your treaty, that you want to be recognized as, I'll use one First Nation or prior First Nation as an example, Tla'amin First Nation. So they've adopted that as the name of their nation. So they're Tla'amin members. And they don't have to use that word sovereignty. They don't even have to use those concepts. They actually take that Indigenous lens of Tla'amin people are actually using their information, local information, for their own needs. And if the outside world wants to connect to those needs or that information, they have to go through the Tla'amin protocols. So they actually are, through whatever process they decide, a community can actually adopt that Indigenous lens, taking some, obviously some colonial practices. We're having a hard time completely, getting away from those, which you've clearly identified, but we're indigenizing. So there is a big difference between the word decolonize and indigenize in my world. So I lean on indigenize, meaning that we do every effort that we can to make sure that all the language that's being used is indigenized versus decolonizing. Decolonizing is going to take a very long time. But if we indigenize these spaces, and specifically in the tech world, we are actually making a huge difference by bringing those TRC actions, calls to actions, into the space and creating that Indigenous lens in spaces that they probably never thought would happen.
I think that's powerful. I think that's an interesting distinction, because I don't know that we've actually heard it expressed that way in our podcast to date, right? That separation of decolonization and indigification, right? Because it speaks to I think to this idea that data sovereignty relates to the idea that data is captured and subject to the laws and governance of the structures that exist within the nation in which it is collected, right? Many Indigenous communities have distinct cultural views regarding data collection and storage and dissemination. And so in many instances, it's communal rather than individual property, right? Or government property, right? So there's a risk that technologies, if not continue to be utilized and defined and created and implemented through that Indigenous lens and that shared lived experience, would by accident or by design pull us back to that colonial interpretation of what sovereignty looks like, and that would infringe on our rights and not respect the principles of sovereignty or the indigification of our identity by that, from the nation directly, right? So that was a pretty powerful distinction you made there, James, and I think that's a lot to reflect on, and some of our listeners, I'm thinking, are having their minds blown a little bit as well.
I mean, I've been doing these hand gestures of exploding things in the background, because I've never thought about this distinction either. Yeah. This is a brand new way of thinking about these things for me. And I've never thought about it in the context of pushing and pulling forces.
Yeah.
Conceptually, I'm fascinated at this idea or this gesture of shaking the hands with the colonizer. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are everywhere. They are ambiguous. They are hard to find, and yet they're ever present in interfaces. They're inner technologies. They are what brought these platforms to us. And so to indigenize, as it were, is to use that handshake as an opportunity to transform by reclaiming and redeploying in those same spaces at the sites of the intersections of these platforms. I'm really fascinated now here, James. I really want to hear you talk about decentralization, because one of the primary tenets of sovereignty and colonialism is the centralization, the concentration of power. And that's what makes it so problematic, right? And so I'm getting the sense here that decentralization is the way that you break down the centralization of power. And in doing so, on these platforms and when we're dealing with information and data and their flows, we get more equal distribution. We get more equity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You got a dog there, eh? That's.
Oh, yeah. I got a dog right here. I got 4 of them. I normally mute them, but here we are.
No, that's great. I'm all about bringing dogs, kids onto podcasts, because they just bring so much life into the room.
Sure.
The decentralization concept, it's really a big part of what I do. And it's almost like once there's an old saying I like to say is, once you know something good, it's hard to go back again. I learned probably 2015, so it wasn't that long ago, that I was introduced to decentralized models. And of course, Bitcoin was where I learned that. And so somebody who had Bitcoin came to me and said, "Hey, James, there's this really cool thing that's out there that you should invest in." And so I was probably early/late adopter of Bitcoin technology, in becoming a decentralized model for financial needs. And but I was also really into researching traditional networking, like cloud-based systems, moving from on-prem to cloud-based computing systems. And I even went the gamut and went into cloud-based edge and fog computing, so that you could have local content in remote locations. obviously the internet was a big part of that. But so while I'm doing all this work and all this research in basic networking, I started to explore that decentralized model, and I started to like fit in that Indigenous lens and start to see that there's some parallels that are taking place that Indigenous people have been doing for generations. So, for instance, trade. If you look at commerce, nations have been trading. Like, I'll just use one example. Lawrence's community probably traded with the Klahoos, resources like fish or wood. We would cross trade, and a value would be of a value. And so I really took that basic concept and applied that to a decentralized model, which anything that is Indigenous is decentralized already. So really, that space is actually driven by Indigenous people already. We're already there. We're already doing it. It's a historical piece of who we are. So you apply that to another layer, which is on a tech level, which is on a blockchain. It's basically the same thing. So that's what really got me involved with self-sovereign identity, for instance, and DIDs and digital identities and how that works with the health system, and eventually thinking about concepts of replacing the status card, and Lawrence is on the cutting edge of, building a wallet, and wonderful. So that's the gamut. There's a huge amount of data there that needs to be explored, needs to understand with that Indigenous lens so that we can move forward with practical solutions.
So James, can I just push a little bit deeper on that? Because I think about,
Please.
we have built a wallet, we have deployed that technology. And I look at it from this context, right? That this technological wave, and we can even start to go down the slippery slope of AI a little bit if we need to, but it's already upon us, right? Like, It's a tidal wave, right? It's if it's not already hit us, we're in the midst of being consumed by it. And unless we as Indigenous people take an early lead in reconstructing that narrative and how those technologies are used, and in terms of the whole context of our conversation up to date, owning and taking custody of what that looks like, we run the risk of the sheer magnitude and weight of that having an impact on our communities, because they're not ready. The associated technologies require a certain level of digital infrastructure and literacy, and sometimes this is lacking, particularly in those remote communities. And so the risk here is that this technology, the emergence of digital technologies, and let's just frame it in that kind of big bubble.
Sure.
Cultural misrepresentation, right? Data sovereignty,
bingo,
digital divide, loss of jobs, all these things, right? And so how, the work that you're doing and the others are doing, and we've talked with, a few guests now, and I'm just blown away by the impact these folks are having in this space. But so it's I guess I'm saying it might be easier said than done. What's your message there to nations who are listening right now thinking, yeah, that's great, James, but how do we do that exactly?
Oh, thanks, Lawrence. Yeah. First off, don't come to me. Like, no, I'm just joking.
Too late.
Yeah, too late.
And even things like privacy and surveillance, right? Like that, even, Tom was talking about earlier, like, we were talking about before the podcast started about how we are being surveilled, whether we like it or not. And how is that defining how technology is being used to further isolate, oppress, marginalize our people? Like, there's just so much here to be aware of, right?
Yeah. Whew, that's like, okay.
That's a series. Another series in all of itself, right? A whole another series.
Yeah, maybe another subject like self-governance. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. So those systems, quite honestly, Lawrence, are tough. An early adoption for communities to understand are really tough. So what we have to do is for that early adoption to take place to combat or mitigate what you just said, those problems that are arising that a lot of cases we have no control over. We have to have community champions, and we have to have leadership to understand how important it is for that champion to have a certain level of education, to be able to work with engineers, to work with nonprofits, to work with government, to make sure that data governance is the absolute foundation, and moving forward, the knowledge to be able to deal with those subjects. That is the ultimate. So if I'm going to do a tech pitch to a First Nation, well, I'd sit down with Chief and Council, and I'd sit down with their ECDEV Corps and all their local community folks, and I'd say, how much do you want to invest in this? How much do you want to see this, your own people become stewards in this? I'm going to suggest the way you explain it, they're going to say, well, we've been doing this forever, James. So like, we just got to make sure we continue to do the right things. And I would never question, their methodologies or how they do things. But there's always a way to impress and improve. And I think that folks like you and I, and then allies, like Tommy, and those other folks that you've had on this podcast, we all have to come together united, and we have to be saying the same message. And we need to get those community champions in place. Obviously, the federal provincial governments are tapped out, and so my biggest thing is, how do we fund that?
Oh, let's not give them an easy way out, James.
I agree.
Don't even go there.
I agree. Yeah. You know where I'm going with that. Yeah. You got it though, Lawrence. Like, you really nailed, what the problem is, and the fear for me is that we will continue on the way we're going, and that digital divide is even greater. So that's what I'm really worried about, because in the 90s it was at a certain level, and I thought I had lots of time to take care of it. But here I am, 2023, and I'm still losing that battle.
Yeah, if there's a thing that brings me to work every day, it's that divide is growing, and it's growing exponentially, and it just causes me all kinds of heartache because if we'll be, at the end of the day, we'll be fine. Indigenous people always figure out a way to survive and make it work.
True.
I mean, if there's one thing I've learned, and you've attested to this, as particularly as a chief, and as when the community, there was a project and it seemed like not much was happening, but it all comes together at the end and it happens, right?
Exactly.
We'll find our way. But my heartache is that there will be people that are lost along the way, and we may not get them back, and there'll be trauma. So there'll be generational trauma associated with that. So I mean, that's the heartache, right? So loud and clear. You have spoken today and conveyed your message with a level of clarity and a level of passion and a real, I think, love of our people with regard to this space. And I just want to acknowledge that as we kind of move to wrap up our session today. Beautiful, man. Beautiful.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks.
Nothing that I can say will ever be more important or as relevant as what Lawrence will contribute, or as importantly, if not more importantly, what our guests will contribute as a final thought on the show. And so what I would like to encourage us to leave with here is the importance of the efforts that are required on either side of the digital divide in order for that divide to close. In order for this to happen, people have to get together and talk, like we're doing on this podcast now. We have to be creative, we have to collaborate, we have to work together. But it requires other things too. Canadians have a lot of work to do in terms of creating and holding space. But we also have to do a much better job educating ourselves as well. Getting the job done requires learning about things that are uncomfortable. It requires learning about the digital divide itself. You said it yourself, James. You've been seeing it since the 90s. A lot of our listeners weren't even born in the 90s. And so my point here is that this is a learning opportunity. This is an opportunity to continue learning, to continue advancing the conversation. And so I'm very grateful to you, James. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing with us your passion and your experience and your wisdom. What I'm leaving this conversation with is gratitude, a reminder for education for our Canadian listeners, and recognizing that even though it's the two of you being here together talking about the work that must be done, Canada has a lot of work to do. You have been an extremely important contributor to this special series that we call One Feather, Two Pens. Thank you so very much for joining us, James.
Oh, it's wonderful.
James,
yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Take a moment to share with us any closing gems. Last word to you, my friend. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thanks. Last word's always tough because you put me on the spot, but yeah, no.
That's why we're laughing and smiling on this side.
Yeah. I'm done. I think while both of you are speaking, I'm greatly attuned to the fact that heart-centered approach, Lawrence, that you explained. And on a personal level, like we all go through our trials and tribulations, struggles with family, relationships, work. Being an entrepreneur is a hills and valley situation. And there's always one thing that brings me back to and really speaks to what we've been talking about, and that's community. Like it's my elders that have brought me here, and so that recognition of them and what they bring to me today, and how I act in public is really critical. So thank you, gentlemen, for us doing this work as men too. We're guys, and we guys tend to lead the tech spaces, and but I'm glad to see that we're doing this work for our communities. And Lawrence, my hands are raised to you for always being that consummate leader. Yeah. And Tommy, thank you for your support, and I look forward to watching and listening mostly to the podcasts that you guys are producing, and I'll support them at all levels and all the work that I do, because you're doing wonderful work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Beautiful, man. Thank you.